past few weeks, we've been talking about whether or not God has an app for various situations in our life. I don't know if you've listened to the news lately or read the newspaper or watched some of the reports on TV. It seems maybe even more the past month or so than normal. People calling attention to crisis after crisis after crisis. There's a crisis with Ebola. There's a crisis with ISIS, which, if it didn't, I don't know, it kind of rhymes. It's almost humorous if you think of it that way. But there's a real crisis with ISIS. There's a crisis with the economy. There's a crisis with this. There's a crisis with that. Everywhere we turn, the world seems filled with crises. For the past 25 years, Jim Cantore, the Weather Channel storm tracker, has tracked, chased, run into, and then reported on some of the most extreme storms on the planet. In a 2011 USA Today article on Cantore, it noted whether he is leaning into the ferocious winds of a hurricane or shivering as a blast of polar air drops down from the Arctic, Cantore is often on the scene to help viewers appreciate how weather tests us. In the spring of 2011, Cantore provided coverage in the midst of severe tornado outbreaks in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Joplin, Missouri. Both towns suffered extensive damage. It was as unthinkable as you would think, Cantore says. Houses were piled up into corners, and the streets looked more like movie sets. But according to Cantore, these kinds of storms pale in comparison to the personal storms of life that some people experience on a daily basis. In particular, Cantore thinks of his two children, both of whom were born with Fragile X syndrome, a genetic disorder that can lead to autistic-like symptoms. Cantore says that his children have the real storms of life, or what he calls the storms that hurt the most and never go away. Cantore says, what my children have to deal with on a daily basis is by far more difficult than anything I will ever come into contact with. So you see, whether it is storms like tornadoes, or whether it is Fragile X syndrome children, or whether it is being afraid of the dark, or being afraid of heights, or even being afraid of clowns, the world often presents to us crises. We are sometimes caught up in crises. Does God have an app for crisis? I think from the scriptures this morning you can tell where I'm going, right? God does. God has an app for crisis. I read that passage from Matthew and I almost have to laugh. Here the disciples are. They're in this boat. They're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. By the way, if you don't know about the ancient world, seas were things that you were very deathly afraid of. Now, the Sea of Galilee to us is just a big lake, but it still could be dangerous. But to the ancient world, seas were very, very mysterious. Seas were very, very dangerous places. And for the Israelis in particular, for the Jewish people, the people of God's covenant, he never really called them to go to sea. The sea was a place of evil. The sea was a place of turmoil. The sea was a place of crisis. But here they are on the Sea of Galilee, and the disciples, of course, in the midst of the storm, focused on the storm, focused on maybe the thunder and lightning, focused on all of the turmoil, and Jesus is asleep. I almost have to laugh. Have you ever known anybody like that? Somebody that can sleep through anything? Just, I can just imagine Jesus snoring. And And the disciples going, Jesus, wake up! I mean, I don't think they just nudged him on the shoulder, do you? I think they were panicked. They were in crisis. And they couldn't understand why he was not in crisis. It reminds me of a sign I saw on the professor's desk one day. Just because you are in crisis does not mean that I am. Right? Just because the disciples were in crisis doesn't mean that Jesus was. Just because our world is in crisis, just because our personal life is in crisis, or even the planet is in crisis, doesn't mean that God is in crisis. God being God, He has other things that He keeps His mind on as well. And I suspect that He sees the crisis, He's concerned about the crisis, but it doesn't panic Him like it does us. Jesus, it doesn't seem in this passage, doesn't seem to wake up and panic along with the disciples. He doesn't join in the crisis. Instead, He says, why are you so untrusting? Why are you so small in your ability to trust? Faith. Recognize refuge. The psalmist is the one who says this. God is our refuge and our strength. One of the things about crisis is that it distracts us from what is true. It distracts us from the fact that God is our refuge. We tend to focus on the problem, not on the solution, and the solution often is provided by God's hand. In his book, Letters to My Children, Daniel Taylor responds to a series of questions by his young children. At one point, his son Matthew asked, "Church is getting boring. Why do we have to go to church?" Here's part of Taylor's reply. Think about it. If a friend of yours is called and says that a famous athlete or singer was going to be at your house and asked if you wanted to come over, wouldn't you go? And wouldn't you be excited? Of course. And so would I. Well, church is a place where God will be every time you go. Of course He is with you whether you're in church or not. But He can be there in a special way with many believers gathered to celebrate Him together. Sounds great, I hear you saying. But then how come you fell asleep so much? Not in Jesus calmed us, but just, sometimes the rhythmic voice, Sometimes I'm just a blessing to people. I bring rest to their life. If God is really there, really there, then how come we aren't bug-eyed and breathless most of the time? That's a good question. I wish I had a very good answer. Part of it is that God knows we can't take very much of Him. It's like when you hold Fluffs, our hamster. If you squeezed very hard, Fluffs would be on his way to hamster heaven. You have to hold him gently. Talk to him quietly. Well, God has to be sort of like that with us. Truthfully, though, the biggest reason might be that we don't want very much of God. We want God to stay in His cage like Fluffs does. We're afraid of losing control of our own lives. We want Him to help us just a little here and forgive us a little there and let us handle the rest. And so we try to make church a safe place where we can get a little bit of God, but not too much. We don't like surprises, not even from God. So we make our churches places where surprises aren't likely to happen. We ask God to come, but only if He'll be polite. And therefore, little kids and adult kids often fall asleep, even if they keep their eyes open. And yet, at the very same time, church is a wonderful place. God has chosen it, its sorriness and all, to be a place where He will meet His people, the place from which He will send His people to all parts of the world to preach the good news about Him. You and I, in the midst of crisis, we need to recognize our refuge. We need to recognize the community from which we draw strength. We need to recognize the God who supplies that community to us. We need to look to the Lord as our refuge, as our rock. We need to recognize refuge, but we also need to face fear with faith. There's a special word for those tightrope walkers who display amazing feats of balance on a high wire. They're called funambulist. Not fundamentalist. Funambulist. In his book, Off Balance with a Purpose, on Purpose, business leader and funambulist Dan Thurman writes that these daredevils are constantly making small, critical adjustments, lifting their free leg as a counterweight, raising and lowering arms, adjusting a pole perhaps. A good funambulist is never truly at rest or on balance. As a matter of fact, Thurman writes, they're perpetually off balance, making adjustments that bring them through a point of balance, only to readjust on the other side. Most of these movements are so subtle that they are imperceptible to the audience. They make it all look effortless. But Thurman says it's not nearly as easy as it looks. How do they maintain their balance? He continued. When new students step onto the rope or table, they almost always begin with the same flawed game plan. They stare downward at the wire to ensure that they have the proper footing, and so they fall. What is the solution to this dilemma? If you've ever watched professional tightrope walkers, you may recall that they never look down at their feet or the wire or on either side at their hands or at the balance pole. Rather, they keep their head up and look forward to the goal, the faraway platform in front of them. So often, with a world filled with crisis, with a personal life perhaps at times filled with crisis, we look at the crisis. Jesus, I think, wakes up to His disciples and is surprised at them not because of the storm, but because they're paying so much attention to it. Don't you know? He says. Don't you understand? He said. You have a God that can be trusted. You have a God that loves you. You have a God that is active through His creation of you and through His continued persistence and pursuit of you. And through His action of loving you, He's acted to redeem you. And this God who is greater than this storm, who's greater than this crisis, who's greater than all of the sum of all of the crises, of all of the history of the globe together, this God will bring you home. Trust Him. Believe Him. Recognize His refuge and face fear with faith. Jesus invites us to a meal. It's a precursor. It's a symbol of a future banquet that He sets for us. He says that He Himself is not going to eat again of the bread or drink of the cup until that meal with us. Interesting. He says that we're to celebrate, we're to remember, so that as we celebrate, we can remember what we're looking forward to. We can remember that He will redeem us. We can remember that He does redeem us out of His love. And so this morning, as you respond to this message, as you respond in whatever the crisis is that you're facing or being distracted by in your life today, remember God. Remember who God is. Remember what God's promise is for you. Remember God's action for you in Jesus. Remember that He will bring you home. Remember to look to that rather than all this other petty stuff like world crisis around us. On the week of September 11th, it's good for us to remember God will provide a way out. That's His effort for crisis. I invite you to turn with me in your hymnal, page 13.